And tonight we are going to talk about Descartes, René Descartes, the very same that you might have heard in courses of history of philosophy as being the father of modern philosophy, or you might have heard his famous saying, "I think, therefore I am." René Descartes is usually pictured on the good side of the scientific revolution, safely on the grounds of modernity. But tonight we are going to try to show you that things are never so simple, that Descartes had to navigate deep and troubled waters of religion and politics in the 17th century, and even his writings were not so securely on the side of the winners as you might believe.
First, about the question of Descartes as the father of modern philosophy, and what that means. I think first it's interesting to point out that when Descartes started writing, he was not the father of modern philosophy. Modern philosophy, well, first of all, what do we mean by modern philosophy? There was an established philosophy that probably begins in the 13th century with figures like St. Thomas Aquinas, goes through the Middle Ages with figures like Occam and Scotus, and then into the 16th and early 17th century with lesser known figures like Suarez, for example, but who were enormously important for their contemporaries. And this is a philosophy that was built largely around the philosophy of Aristotle, which was not at all uncontroversial when St. Thomas began teaching it, but by the 16th century had become sort of the standard fare that everybody learned in school, and was very closely associated with the church. At first, of course, the Catholic Church, but later on in the 16th century with Protestant sects, particularly Lutheranism and Calvinism. The people who were considered the moderns were the people who rebelled against that and who offered an alternative to that, which was considered enormously dangerous, because by the time you get to the 16th century, the official philosophy had become thoroughly intertwined with religious doctrine. You know, issues particularly like the Eucharist, transubstantiation, the resurrection of the body, the idea of Christ as embodied, and so on. All of these things and many more were deeply intertwined with this particular Aristotelian philosophical program, the Aristotelian philosophy had always been controversial, but by the end of the 16th century, there was a movement of people who wanted to replace it. At first, Descartes was just one of many people who wanted to replace the modern philosophy, the established philosophy, who wanted to challenge the authority of not merely to replace the philosophy, but to challenge the authority of the teachers, and through that seemed to challenge the authority of the church. He doesn't become the father of modern philosophy until later in the century, when a lot of these earlier figures get forgotten, and Descartes becomes, in a certain way, the face of modern philosophy. We think of him now, when you learn about him, in your philosophy class, in your general sort of intellectual history class, we think of him in terms of cogito ergo sum, the emphasis on the individual and the certainty of our knowledge of ourselves.
To ask Vlad the same question, what is your favorite story about Descartes? It's difficult to say. Thank you very much for this question. So I think that Descartes was in the beginning not an established person, established philosopher. And he fled away from France. He get to the Province Unie, to Holland, to North Holland, and become a more isolated figure, maybe also in a retreat, in an intellectual retreat. There he achieved to touch to many disciplines of science and to philosophy in general, and to ask himself the main questions of philosophy: if God exists, if he as a soul exists, in responding also to claim of the Catholic Church, of the Catholic theologians, which made appeal to philosophers in order to prove two things: the existence of God and the immortality of soul. So, as a good son of the Catholic Church, Descartes attempted to do these tasks, to achieve these tasks, and to offer a personal answer to these questions: the demonstration of the existence of God and the demonstration of the immortality of the soul. That was also the reason for which the first edition of the meditations, of the metaphysical meditations, had this false subtitle, the demonstration of the immortality of the soul. So Descartes does not demonstrate, properly speaking, the immortality of the soul, but he made a room, I think, for this perspective. So he was more isolated at the beginning of his philosophical career, but he achieved to establish a network, a very important network, through his correspondence with the whole learned Europe. Of course, in employing also some mediators, such as Marat Mersenne, who was in Paris and was his principal correspondent until 1649, but also through other people, through Netherlands people, through Frenchmen, through Italian also. And so he became a sort of center of the learned Europe.
So in the 17th century, when someone tried something new on his own as an outsider, he usually got in trouble. We saw how Galileo got in trouble. We saw how Spinoza got in trouble. How did Descartes get in trouble then, Garber? You need to switch on the microphone.
Descartes got in trouble with everybody. But let me begin by going back, a little bit. Descartes, when he was young, was very bold, and his view was, and he tells the story in part one of the Discourse on the Method, which is a wonderful piece of literature, about how, as a young man, he went to school hoping that he would learn all of these marvelous things from these wonderful teachers. But after finishing the course of study, realized they didn't really know anything. And so as soon as he possibly could, he tells the reader, he left school to go out into the world to start philosophy anew. A bold project of rejecting everything that he had learned and starting everything anew. The works that we have begin with a treatise on method that he never finished. He wrote then a treatise on metaphysics, which corresponds to, which is supposed to correspond to the Meditations, which is the one that begins with the doubt and the cogito argument. And then he sketched out a whole physics. And then Galileo got condemned. And when Descartes found out about that, he realized the danger that he was in presenting new ideas and the possibility for real disaster. So he withdrew all of the works from publication. None of those works that he had worked on were published in that form during his lifetime. He initially decided that he was going to publish nothing. Within a few years, though, within a couple of years, he decided, well, maybe that's not such a good idea. He seriously believed that he had a new philosophy that was going to change everything, and he was very eager to share it. But what he did was he put it in a form that would hide the originality.
What's interesting is that Descartes seems to be aware that negative publicity is actually good publicity, because he writes to Regius at some point. So Regius just gave a first reply to Voetius, and his reply was banned. And so Descartes writes to Regius that the ban of your book had no other effect but increasing the desire to buy it and to study it more attentively.
Yes, absolutely.
So do you think that Descartes maybe did this being aware that this, let's say, negative publicity is actually good for his reputation? Or it was somehow unintended?
A little bit of both. A little bit of both. He, I think he had been very careful before that. And what he tells Regius in one of those letters where he's giving Regius advice is, do like me. Don't explicitly say that you're against all of these sort of traditional ideas. People will figure it out eventually. But if you say it too boldly, you'll just get them angry and you'll get into trouble. And he was obviously very rattled by Galileo's condemnation. Right. That's why he withdrew his earlier works. But at the same time, and his initial publication or the publication of the Meditations with the objections and replies was very controlled. He wanted to present himself in a way that would be both new, but at the same time, not so new that it would get people angry. He was, I think, kind of upset by the fact that there was this enormous reaction to him. He had lost control, but at the same time, I'm sure that he was pleased that everybody was talking about him.
How was the condemnation taking place? Why? What was the reason, and how did it happen?
Well, so far it's been quite good. I mean, the dialogue between Dan Garber and Vlad Alexandrescu has been quite rich with problems in the Netherlands, and then after the problems in the Netherlands, after the death of Descartes, you get also problems in in France, in the Catholic Church, but they're actually connected. In fact, they're connected by the Low Countries, but basically in Belgium. So the Catholic troubles begin fairly early, around 1662 at Leiden. At Leuven, at Louvain. There were problems at Leiden before then. That's not Belgian. So what happens is that they really were Cartesians, and then the Cartesians, independently of Descartes, were a little bit more uppity, as it were, more vocal about their Cartesianism and their and their ideas that didn't perfectly cohere with the Catholic Church. And so from Louvain, you get letters to Rome, which then provoke the censure of Rome, so that the Descartes' work gets put on the index, and then the kind of the French authorities come into play, given that, and start individually banning Descartes from being taught at the University of Paris, and it spreads. And so by the end of the century, you've got general condemnations of Cartesianism as being a kind of a philosophy that could confuse the mysteries of the Catholic faith, which is essentially the way that the king puts his ban of condemnation of Cartesianism from being taught in the schools. And you get priests who were teaching what the authorities found to be Cartesian, fired from their jobs. And it becomes kind of an outside the school, inside the school thing, until you find more Cartesians in the school that are able to navigate these treacherous waters. But yeah, the condemnations start in the Netherlands with in the 40s and the 50s. Descartes dies in the 50s, and then you see a little bit of a peace for a while, and then the issues are reborn. But they come from the Netherlands to France, and then it's spread. Is that a little piece to fill in? But I mean, I find both accounts by Dan and Vlad persuasive.
I would argue that Descartes was not so scandalous, and I rely on one of your study, Roger, when you say that finally Descartes was the adept, the tenant of the void, of the non-existence of the void, so as Aristotle was. And some of the new Aristotelians were moderate on this issue, were more relative. So Descartes was very opposed, for example, to Pascal, who experimented and made the void more acceptable for the general opinion. So not only he was against the existence of the void, but he gave a sort of explanation of the movement which relied on the non-existence of the void and of the general, movement of bodies which abhorred void in some respect. So it's true that some physical and cosmological views of Descartes were a little bit strange, such as these elements, 3 kinds of elements. And I read this afternoon, I reread the Admiranda Methodus of Boëthius, which is a great text. Boëthius says, how could you know that there is different figures and different dimensions of the 3 elements of the corpuscles of the 3 elements? You cannot see them. You cannot experiment them. So it's only imagination, only totally out of the blue, this question. So also this interesting point of a very small point which has dimensions, which has a figure for Descartes. The corpuscle has a figure, but being divisible. So the figure is quite small and quite characteristic, but the figure is also divisible and divisible and divisible. So it was not acceptable. I think that for many reasons, Descartes was very provocative. And some people, which of course pertain to the established system, became very critical. I mean, now, today, we see Descartes as a leading figure, as the father of modernity, etc., etc. But at this time, at that time, it was not very clear.
When Voetius accuses Descartes of atheism, it's certainly a different understanding from what atheism means today. Could you say a little bit what atheism meant in the 17th century, then maybe? In what sense could Voetius say about Descartes that he was an atheist when Descartes gave the famous demonstrations for the existence of God? In what sense could he be an atheist?
Can I
Yeah, sure, Dan.
come in on that? I think Alan Force, sort of a historian of atheism and free thinking in 17th and 18th centuries, has a very interesting observation about about what atheism meant. And it didn't mean literally not believing in God, but it was a term of general criticism for people whose conception of God was different from yours. So from the point of view of Catholic, you know, Luther was an atheist because his conception of God was different. Or Calvinist was an atheist. Calvin was an atheist. And so I'm sure it is the case that Descartes' conception of God was different than Voetius's. But and because of that, that theological difference was sufficient for people to say that, for somebody like Voetius to say that Descartes was an atheist. And it comes up with Spinoza again. God is at the center of Spinoza's ethics. And Spinoza denies explicitly in his letters, and I think quite honestly, that he is an atheist. On the other hand, he certainly was read by many people in the period as an atheist.
We discussed about the condemnation of Galileo, and we discussed about the excommunication of Spinoza. And my feeling there was that there was a certain unavailability, that they got into trouble. There was nothing to be done. They were not really, in the case of Spinoza, Stephen and Isaac persuaded us that Spinoza actually looked for it, or in any case, he didn't bother, really didn't care. In the case of Galileo, it's a bit more complex, but in the case of Descartes, however, you were saying, and I would like to know more about that Descartes was very careful from very beginning, and he wanted to avoid this at all costs. And still, he couldn't. He couldn't because it couldn't have been avoided, because philosophy is bound to get in trouble with the established authorities and be accused of atheism?
No, I think you have to look at the circumstances. What got Descartes condemned was not anything Descartes said directly himself, but what Regis said. That's what got him started. Well, okay, in the Protestant case, in the case of the problems at Utrecht, it was Regis, who was an enthusiastic follower, who was willing to be more provocative than Descartes himself was willing to be. That got him in trouble, that got Descartes in trouble. Originally, Fishes was attacking Regis, but eventually, you know, as the affair went on, he turned his attention at that point to Descartes. That was Vlad had mentioned the Admiranda Methodist, the book that Schuck/Fishes had written, you know, against Descartes. But it was originally had Regis not sort of stuck his neck out, I'm not sure that there would have been that kind of reaction.
To kind of make things a bit more general, when we talk about accusation of atheism, that if you look at the end of the century context in England, since you're invoking some of the English context, if you look at the kind of correspondence that happens around, you know, Leibniz-Clark correspondence or the end of the century correspondence of Newtonians, one has the feeling that everyone accuses everyone else of atheism and nothing happens. Not such a big deal. Every single philosopher has been accused of being an atheistic figure or has accused someone else. Meanwhile, at the beginning of the 17th century, you have the feeling that it was very dangerous to be accused of being atheistical. Now, Descartes is in the middle of these two extremes. Was it a real danger for him or not anymore?
Well, probably not being burned at the stake. I'm trying to think of any figure that was burned at the stake after Vanini, which was 1619. I think there was an obscure character I know of in Paris in the early 1620s who may have been. But can you think of, Roger, Vlad, Steve, Grigore, can you think of anybody who was burned at the stake after, say, the early mid-1620s?
Or killed in other ways? I mean, let's be...
Or killed in other ways, yeah.
Not burned, but cancelled.
Yes.
Cancel culture.
Yes, no, absolutely. It was there was
cancel. You know what I mean.
Absolutely. There was that, but the thing is, you can still go on living your life, you know, and talking to your friends and thinking you're dangerous.
What was Descartes facing really as danger? Imprisonment or just his books being...
Well, imprisonment, certainly.
Yes.
So the bell rang and he was summoned to the university, I think, to reply to the accusations. And then he got really frightened. But at the same time, he had these high connections. So the French ambassador, the Prince of Orange, and of course, Constantine Huygens. So I'm not sure whether he was really in danger having these connections, but at the same time, he got frightened at some point.
Right. Well, but look, Galileo had high connections as well.
Yeah.
And he was put under house arrest.
Yeah.
He was not executed, but it was still a punishment. On the other hand, it was punishment in comfortable apartments where all of the important people in Europe came to visit him. It underscored his fame and his importance.
But Galileo retracted his opinion, but Bruno, who did not retract, was
Right.
burnt.
But that was 40 years earlier.
No, 20, in 1600.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So 30,
But Galileo
33
was
years.
condemned in
33.
1632.
Yeah, yes, but he retracted.
But still, Galileo was refused Christian burial. He was buried under a grave with no name on it. How about Descartes? Would have he faced the same kind of thing? No. Or yes?
There are people who suggest that Descartes was poisoned in Stockholm, and that he was poisoned by a Catholic priest. Which is very thrilling.
You seem to find it very amusing, though.
Well, it's ironic because, of course, Queen Christina then converted to Catholicism and went to. I would imagine it would have been a Lutheran minister who might have.
You would poison it? You would poison it?
I don't know, because I mean that was one of the great victories of Catholicism was when Christina converted and moved to Italy.
How is this much richer story that we have told tonight affecting our current reading of Descartes' philosophy? So what we have learned tonight, in what way what we have learned tonight should modify the way we go to read the Descartes' discourse or Descartes' meditation tomorrow morning?
I think it's very important to think that Descartes was a work in progress. I think a sort of work in progress from the Discours de la méthode, which was intended to be open to objections and to replies. Initially, he has had to be published with objections and replies, but this project was not accomplished. And then the meditations, of course, the same thing. And then the great effort of Descartes to answer all the letters which he had from other people. Show us that he was very open to discussion, and as Dan has said, was very convinced that his reason and reason in general has to be attained and convince people. And what have we learned this evening? I think we have learned that philosophy has no chance to be accepted by people if philosophers are not open to society and to students and to professors also for answering objections and commentaries. And I think in this respect, our modernity is very Cartesian. So we have Facebook, we have Twitter, we have WhatsApp, we have Dana Jalobeanu, in order to put us together and to comment and to exchange ideas. This is the great lesson, Descartes' great lesson, I think.
Dan?
What I would take away is that you can't take a text and read it in isolation. That a good deal, I think, of the meaning of the text, the importance, the significance of the text, is who it was written for, who it was written against, what the context of the discussion was. The way in which, in part, sort of contingent circumstances sort of shape the history of the text and its acceptance, and even to a certain extent its meaning. I mean, we didn't go into a lot of detail about the actual discussions that were being conducted, but they really did shape what it is that Cartesianism meant, and that if we don't look at these texts, and not just Descartes, but I think any interesting philosophical text, in its intellectual, social, and political context, then we're missing something important about it. And I'm hoping that maybe if people are interested in going back to Descartes, they might begin to look at some of the literature that puts Descartes into into that larger context. And here I would recommend, first of all, some of Roger's work, since he's sitting here.
Good. Grigore, how about you?
I'm thinking about this idea stemming somehow from Dan, that in order to become popular, you have to be condemned. Or that great philosophers are bound to be condemned, right? Like Galileo, Spinoza, and now we have Descartes. But at the same time, we have some a movement like Newtonianism, which becomes popular without being condemned. So, in a sense, I'm trying to understand what was with Newtonianism. It became popular because of its truth, or is this metaphysical speaking? So I end up with being unsure about this. What about you, Dana? Can you draw a conclusion?
I was wondering how I'm going to go tomorrow and reread the beginning of the discourse, because we've been talking a lot about Descartes' metaphysics, but not enough about his scientific treatises, and he published them anonymously together with the discourse, kind of early on, as if science itself is dangerous, not only his metaphysics.
Yeah.
So maybe there is something in what Grigore said, that you first have to be condemned and then you impose your ideas. I don't know.
Yeah, but look, Newtonianism was accepted in a way for its truth,
Yeah.
right?
No, I think that you're absolutely right. I think the case of Newton is different from the case of Descartes.
Roger, what do you think?
Could I add that Leibniz tried to have Newton condemned because he thought he was very dangerous and that nobody should be following Newton. He just didn't have any real clout or anything, but you know, you can find those cases too.
Yeah, so once church didn't have enough power, philosophers tried to excommunicate each other.